Well, because Christianity, like as an institution, is still subject to those same mimetic processes that control our world, and so Christianity, what does it end up doing? I mean, this is like the conversation I just hosted about King's North against Christian civilization. Like,
Yes.
if anyone didn't realize it, like this is all hanging in the background of that conversation for sure. Welcome to Grill Country. Today I'm joined by two very good friends, Jess, who is now a Grill Country partner. He's the guy who's up the thumbnail game and give us a little bit of like post production value in the video quality. And he's the guy who did tech for us at the conference that we had, and so a friend and partner of Grill Country. And then we're also joined by my friend Yosef, who is one of those, there are people in our lives that we just value every time we get to talk to them, and we wish we could talk to them more. And Yosef is one of those people for me because every time I'm in conversation with Yosef, he helps me to see something I wasn't able to see before and helps me come into a deeper understanding of what I would say is reality. And I'm very grateful for that. So I'm very glad that they could join me today. I'm going to actually let Jess kind of take the lead on the conversation today, though, because we're going to talk about the book of Job. And specifically, we all read Rene Girard's book on Job, a victim of his people. And so we're going to talk about what Girard contributes to the discussion about the book of Job. And I have no idea where the conversation is going to go, and I'm looking forward to seeing where Jess takes us as we discuss with him. Hopefully, we are better friends than Job's friends to Jess.
Right. All right. Well, thanks, Nate. This came about because Nate messaged me a while back and was like, "Did you know Girard wrote a book on Job?" And I was like, "No. I did not know that." And it seems like it's kind of a rare book. It was kind of hard to, I mean, you can find copies, but they're not cheap. And it's not a very big book. So the book is Job, the victim of his people. And you can see like it's not super thick. It's not a big volume, but it is, if you're into Rene Girard or into the book of Job, it's very interesting. So I guess what I'll do is I'll start out just kind of giving kind of a brief summary of what Girard's doing in the book, and then and maybe some important sort of things that I saw that he's sort of emphasizing and pointing out, and then we can kind of go from there. But Nate, you've read a bunch of Girard, right?
Yeah. Fair amount, yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess I'm coming into it kind of knowing the book of Job pretty well. And then I haven't read any Girard. My knowledge of Girard has kind of come from other videos and other people talking about him. So I had a pretty good idea of his theories of mimesis and the scapegoat mechanism and the mimetic desire, and then the conflict that ensues from that. So I kind of understood like his the structure for his argument surrounding the scapegoat. Right. And so what was interesting for me is that in this book, he kind of is approaching the book of Job and applying his framework as he's looking at the book. He's definitely not just forcing his framework onto the book at all. He's actually coming to the book with a fairly open mind, but still making judgments based on what he knows about his own theory.
I can see how some people would think he's forcing his framework on the book, though, and I want to address that right up front, because I think that one of the things that people who maybe have a passing familiarity with Girard don't understand, that like mimetic theory isn't just this cute theory that is about a mimesis, and that's all there is to it. When you really understand what Girard's saying, his mimetic theory is a theory of everything. what he's saying is that this is what creates our world.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying that that world that it creates, that its God is the God of the persecutor,
Mm-hmm.
who we originally referred to as Satan. And so it's super radical. On the one hand, I wouldn't say he's forcing it into that, but it's like it's one of those things. It's like once you've decided that like this is the pattern that best explains reality, just like any frame that you have, where it's like that fundamental a frame, you're going to start seeing it everywhere.
Yeah, I could see Yosef already
Yeah,
like
I mean, because
jumping
it
at the
definitely
bit
feels
here.
to me, it felt certainly a little forced from the parts I got to get to. Um, I mean, it's a lot like, I don't know, we can pick anyone we want. We could pick Marx or Freud or like any of the modernists who like, have a grand arc of history theory, and the narrative and a telos, and it feels just, I mean, I don't know if the word is forced, but like, just like, Freud's going to see phalluses everywhere. In some ways, kind of how I feel like Girard is seeing, his stuff everywhere.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's similar also because there's only one drive, right? Like for both of them, as opposed to other theories where there's multiple fundamental drives or whatever, and there's a balance. Like they have one primary drive, and that therefore everything has to fit into it, which
Right.
be very, I mean,
Well,
to
yeah,
me, it
that's
does
it.
feel
Yeah, this is interesting. So this is kind of where you're actually kind of like you're drifting a little bit toward like where I kind of like where I think Girard misses it, and I actually think part. Okay, this is something that I don't know if I'm ready to talk about this in this conversation because I'm still working through this. But I've been started rereading David Graeber's book Debt recently, and Graeber, like early on in that book, he actually talks about like the deep connection between our language about debt and our moral language. And I actually think that what Girard misses is that I actually think that um, the concept of debt is actually deeper than mimesis. It's actually a prerequisite for having mimesis. So it's not that Girard is wrong about observing the mimetic processes in human cultures, but that they are not the deepest layer.
hmm.
There's something deeper than that. And I think you kind of have to have, and those things, you need to start to have those things talk to each other and figure out how they connect and interrelate. And this to me has to do with like, well, basically how we are to understand sacrifice, which is what Girard is critiquing, and how do we understand gift, and if they are, what is the nature of the relationship between sacrifice and gift?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think that's connected to debt. And the reason it's connected to debt is that I think that what differentiates sacrifice and gift is that sacrifice requires that you have some sense of ownership over what is sacrificed. Because the idea of me the idea of me sacrificing something that belongs to you it's incoherent. I don't. How can that be
yeah,
understood to
this
be a
is
sacrifice? It didn't belong to me in the first place. I'm giving up nothing. So whatever I sacrifice, I have to have had some claim on it in order to sacrifice it.
but of course, I mean, this gets into a point that we've discussed, right? That it doesn't make any sense from like a Hebrew biblical perspective, because the Hebrew biblical perspective is God owns everything. So all sacrifices that God commands, of course, are always things that you're giving back to God that are already His. So it can't be that the framing is something that I have a claim on. Fundamentally, that can't be the claim, right?
Right.
The claim has to start from somewhere else, and the claim there is.
But I think I understand exactly what you're saying, and I agree with you.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with what you said. I would,
Well, I know you.
although I would only go a little bit further. I would say that everything, everything seemingly by right should belong to God, but God relinquishes His own ownership and gives up everything, including Himself, totally and without reserve, and doesn't actually claim it for Himself, even though it is His by rights.
I
This
don't
is
think so,
actually what,
though.
and that's what makes Him God.
I don't think that's coherent with its biblical text. And the only way to make it coherent is to do what Girard does, which is basically say these parts are not the biblical text. I'm not going to count this as the actual scripture. I'm not going to read, right? He throws out huge parts of the books of Job in this book. But like to me, the only way for your argument to work is if we just throw out all of the curses in Deuteronomy and
Well, he's
Leviticus,
making
all
a
of the
text.
stuff about
He makes a textual criticism that is not. He's not the only one to make
he makes it
about
further
certain
than even
parts of.
academics. No. Academics say it's not the prologues are not original.
Let
He
me
says
let me
none of it is, right? He says none of Elihu, the wisdom poem, none of God's speech, like all of that. He says is not part of it.
Yeah, let me kind of explain for the audience kind of
Yeah.
what Girard does here, which is interesting. So Girard has his mimetic theory, meaning that there's people in society basically mimic each other. This produces mimetic conflict because when you're trying to all do the same thing, there becomes someone who's doing it the best, and then in some, at some point there reaches enough social energy and conflict that there needs to be some sort of release. So this is where the scapegoat comes in, and this is not necessarily he's explicitly said he's not using the scapegoat as the scapegoat's defined in Leviticus. He's using the scapegoat as sort of as we define it in our
In
common
our common
parlance.
sense usage of the term
Yeah,
scapegoat.
in the Western world, um, uh, and it would be to find someone to blame and then put the sin on them, sort of thing, to dispel this energy and all this fervor that's trapped in society. And the thing that he says is like it actually works. You exile them, you murder them, you sacrifice them, then there's actually a catharsis in the society, a calming effect that calms all these all this energy that had built up. Is that fair to say? Okay, so Girard's coming at the Book of Job with this, and one of the interesting things is that a lot of people like to read the first of Job, maybe a little bit in the middle, and then read the end of with God's speech and the conclusion. So they like to read the intro, God's speech, and the conclusion because I mean there's a lot there, and so like I'm reading Jung's analysis of Job, and that's what he does, and this is what most people do. What's interesting with Girard is he goes right for the middle part of Job, and he almost he throws out the beginning. He
Well,
says the
he does.
beginning.
I want to qualify that. I want to qualify that because that's not
Okay.
really quite what he does. Because he doesn't say that those texts shouldn't. He doesn't say those texts shouldn't be there. What he says is that those texts obfuscate the actual meaning of Job.
Yeah, and he does make a nuanced argument for that it actually plays a purpose in preserving the middle sections that he said
Correct.
would have been disposed of long ago if it wasn't like protected by these sort of false end caps that are then added to the text later on. But so he does say that he's like it kind of is this like protective thing that allows it to make it into the Christian Bible.
He effectively attributes it to providence that those parts of the
Right.
text which he critiques remain.
Right. So anyway, but he goes right for the middle section, which is all the speeches, and then he goes in there and he finds portions of the text that basically he says the whole idea that God is making a bet with Satan and that God and Satan are exacting this tragedy onto Job. He's like, that's nonsense. What is actually happening is the scapegoating process. And you can hear this because Job doesn't talk about the loss of his property or the loss of his children in the middle part. He's only talking about how people have turned against him, how they're treating him differently. And so Girard analyzes the whole middle section in the terms that Job is being made a scapegoat by the people, and then
but if Girard is right about it in his own ideas, and I think he sort of partially hints at this at least one spot in the text, but I think he could have spent more time here. If his thesis is correct, then the the prologue is still true, because it is through the mob that institutes the collective violence against the scapegoat that Satan acts in the world as the god of the persecutors.
So
yeah, I was thinking that you could make a Girardian argument for what the prologue's doing, but he's kind of funny because he doesn't do that. He
Right.
he just is like, the prologue is just nonsense, and
Well, because his focus is on he wants to get us to the point of our recognition of our complicity in the process, and if we can just and if we just say Satan without recognizing the role in which we play in executing the will of Satan or the god of the persecutors, then it's not doing its full work.
Yosef.
yeah.
I really hope Razin would be here too, so there'd be at least another Jewish voice in the conversation.
I mean, look, I think he misses allusions to what happens, because I do think that the prologue and the other parts that he dismisses as not being original to the book actually do engage and are really well fabricated into the book. I think he misses it. I don't know if that's because of a translational issue, or if that's just because he is very focused on one thing and he doesn't pick up on the nuances. He's not a careful reader, which he isn't per se. Forget the Hebrew. I don't think he's a careful reader of the book, and that's very frustrating to me, because I do think because I think not only could potentially the prologue speak to what he's doing, but because he doesn't really grapple with it or really God's speeches. I mean, I think he handles them too dismissively ultimately, and that is very frustrating, and because he doesn't take them seriously enough to be true. And I think in some ways that makes it no longer dialogic, right?
Yeah, and I think you can see, Yosef, the kind of why he does that, I kind of agree with him, to be honest, but this is why I think he does that. One of Girard's main points is that the complexity is an illusion that's distracting us from a simple truth that we refuse to see. So that's why he's disinclined to want to carefully consider
Listen to a different version. There's another version of reading Job where you actually have to read the book. And with Jess and I had this conversation. You have to read the book chapter by chapter and go through the process yourself of that entire dialectical, complex process and all the tensions in order to work it out through yourself. And you can't skip to the end. And to me, Girard, because he has a theory already, he wants to skip to the end. He wants to just kind of say, this is what I could abstract from the book, and this I can disseminate to everyone, and here's the deep truth, the hidden wisdom under the mountains. And of course, if he took the wisdom poem seriously, which he doesn't, then he would know that you can't get to the gold under the mountain that way. That's not really that's the limit that humans can reach, but that's not how you get, there's something beyond that. You have to go through the process to get there. And if you don't go through the complexities of the dialogue and actually take the entire book as as this back and forth and this journey, then you can't do it. And I think that's also really part of this is also, he says, there's an audience here that, is basically the threatening mob. Another reading, right, Jess has said, wouldn't it be interesting if someone read this as a theatrical thing where people were there and they were going through the process of the book. Those are two different ways to kind of do this as theater, right? And thinking about who and how the audience is. The problem is that we have no evidence this book ever was read liturgically out loud in a group setting, right? That's even in ancient Israel, medieval, Christians or Jews, people did not engage the text that way, which is also interesting. But even the book itself doesn't lend itself to that, right? The friends are by themselves with Job. The only time we have an audience is at the end, when they end in the epilogue, where of course Girard doesn't, except he only likes one line from that whole thing, but he misses the redemption of the in the eyes of the community, which would help his theory, honestly, but he doesn't want to grapple with that because again, it adds layers of complexity, and it negates in some ways his his main point, perhaps, which is also complicating. So
Well,
I
I think he does
Go
engage
into
with
that.
because
Go into
he
that a little bit more, Yosef.
which part? Oh, negating his main point.
Yeah, well, I want to hear how you think that the way that
Because
the
because
redemption in the text refutes Girard's theory. I want to at least hear you out.
okay, because there's throughout this whole book, right? There's no evidence that there's any sort of audience. And I think this is the type of thing where it's really complicated because for Girard's theory to work, it only works if there is an audience. So he has to posit that because otherwise there's no threat. The only threat there seems to be, and it's not even from, I don't even think there's really one from the friends. The only time we ever hear about like the way that other people are treating, or whatever is in Job's own head. Job psychologically is convinced that that the masses in some way, the wild men, and I mean, he has all different groups of people, right? Somehow that they will do something against him. That's in his head, but there's nothing else rooting, to me, this fear, like this actual threat from the masses, and anything else beyond Job's own psychology, which is
yeah.
kind of a
Well,
very different way than Girard's taking.
Girard even says that. He says, "Here's the difficulty. There's no explicit violence in the text against Job." And so then he says, "This is the hard thing that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to point to the structure at play." And so one of the main ways he elucidates the structure that he's seen is through a speech that Eliphaz gives. I think it's even in chapter 4. I can't remember what chapter. Anyway, talks about the path of the wicked. So Eliphaz talks about the path that the wicked take, and then he describes the path and how it leads to destruction and how it leads to being cursed and this stuff. And in the the whole thing is basically sort of saying, Eliphaz is saying to Job, you are on the path of the wicked. Now,
Yeah, the ancient trail
yeah,
is the
and
phrase that
so like
Bart picks
the
up
way
on.
I've been reading Job, yeah, the ancient trail, the path that the wicked take. And so Girard says, see, they understand that there's this process that's going to be taking place. Job's already because of the disaster, or Job is already on the path to becoming the scapegoat. And now there's a process underway in order for the scapegoating process to be fulfilled. And so Girard actually will compare Job and Oedipus to each other. And the difference is that Job never confesses,
Right.
and Oedipus does. And so one thing that Girard says needs to happen is that I don't agree with this, but this is what Girard says, that basically Job has to play along and he has to say that he is guilty so that the whole process can take place and that the scapegoating will work, because he talks about how the scapegoating process sort of emerges naturally out of the societal conditions of the mimetic rivalries and all this stuff. But he says what it has to be done is it has to be ritualized so that it's properly done, because the first time the scapegoating thing happens and the catharsis happens in society, people say, oh, this is what God had wanted from the beginning. So now we have to ritualize this process in order to make sure we get it right. And we, and people are at least unconsciously aware that they don't want to persecute someone who isn't a scapegoat. So what they're doing is putting Job through the ringer. Job is supposed to confess his wrongs, the evil that he's done, and then there'll be this catharsis in society. It will calm these things, whatever.
Right.
Well,
it's important. I want. This is at this point we need to. I want to just interject really quickly here because.
But that's the path. That's the path of the wicked that he sees Job
going
down.
One thing that I think Yosef should perhaps give Girard a little more credit for saying is that Girard understands fully how unique the Hebrew scriptures are in comparison to the Greek to the Greek tragedies that he's comparing them, because it is only in the Hebrew scriptures that you ever see the voice of the victim represented.
No, that's not true. That's the problem. This is the problem. We want to make it super unique, and it's not unique. The scapegoat ceremony predates, I mean, it depends on how we understand when Torah is given, all that stuff. But we know that from the 3rd century BCE, throughout the ancient Near East, we had scape animal ceremonies already. That was where they were not blaming humans. Human sacrifice still occasionally occurs in various ways. We know that, of course. But it is much more prevalent in Greece. Well, actually, it's a whole question now in modern archaeology. But at least the thought was during Girard's day that it was much more prevalent in ancient Greece and Roman societies. We did not see that, even
No,
from
I don't think
Egypt to the
Girard's not
Hittites to
saying.
the Musi.
I don't think that Girard is not. Girard is not suggesting that there wasn't like that. That there was no history of experience with mimetic processes in ancient Hebrew culture. He's not saying that at all. It would actually be self defeating because
No,
I mean, it wouldn't. It would cease to be the theory of everything that it is for him,
I'm
if
not
that were
saying
the
it's not
case.
unique.
What he's saying is that the Hebrew scriptures, in particular in the Psalms, and he makes a direct comparison between the voice of the victim as you find it in the Psalms and in the dialogues of Job from the perspective of Job. What is unique is that in the Greek tragedies, the voice of the victim is never heard.
Yes, in Greece, but that's not true in the rest of the ancient Near East. This is a fundamental problem with Girard, is he thinks he's so universal because that he's basing a theory off Greece and off the western edge of this whole area where there's a massive set of diverse civilizations, many of which are doing very similar things to the Hebrew scripture. And even here, the fact that he doesn't even know to recognize that is like a real limitation on him, and that's very frustrating, right? Like we know that people were mitigating, whatever you want to say, or releasing the cycle of scapegoating from humans much earlier and much more broadly than just ancient Israel, right? We can talk about some unique aspects of the ancient Israelite one, and there are
I'm
some
not.
things that
I mean,
they have to innovate.
I think what Nate's trying to say is that the voice of the victim gets
Even from the voice of the victim. The voice of the victim is heard in Babylonian psalms. That's the problem. The voice of the victim and some of the Egyptian ones, honestly, once we get to shift to individual piety in 12th century or so Egypt, like we hear the voice of the victim in these things. He just isn't aware of that. Okay, but like that doesn't mean that, I mean, look, I'm all for the uniqueness of the Hebrew Bible. I'm not gonna, but like there are some things where I'm not gonna try to extend that argument too far because we know that wasn't the case.
Okay.
Well, can you give me a specific concrete example?
Oh gosh, run downstairs and probably pull up some books, but like,
I know this is important. This is important because this is really important because as Girard talks about when he gets to the section when he gets toward the end of the book and he has the chapter where he talks about the God of the victims, right? It's very, very easy for the voice of the victim to be taken up in such a way that it is still a cry for vengeance, in which case it is a new god of new persecutors looking to change its scapegoat target. So I have no doubt that there are texts from all over the entire world where you can see that.
mm-hmm. And
But
so what? But yeah,
but I doubt that you will find anything that actually proclaims the innocence of the victims.
oh, for sure, there's innocence of the victims. Here, there's a collection called the Babylonian Penitential Psalms. Let me see if I can pull up a copy. Boredom seems to have a copy. Yeah, I mean, often in these psalms, I'm trying to get the actual text in front of me, but often in them, the people are actually going against the gods. They're saying, because they perceive the gods, the pagan gods, as very arbitrary, and they say, "I haven't done anything. Why are you punishing me?"
Mm-hmm.
Like so that we do have stuff like that. In fact, I sent Jess a paper about on the dream sequence in Job 3:4 that
Mhm.
talks about a set of Babylonian psalms where the guy is saying, I'm innocent, stop punishing me." These are, so this collection is 1600 BCE. So depending on how you date the Bible, either contemporaneous or before, certainly probably before Job.
Yeah, 1600 BC, almost certainly before.
Right. So like it's saying like so some of these do go the other way. Some of them are, my sin forgive me, lift up my countenance. Some of them are like that, but some of them are food I did not no, sorry, let's see. Water I did not quaff. So I didn't steal the water. But you're making it flows from my eyes. I have not oppressed this man, and yet you take away my
Water I did
food.
not. Why is there not? Water I did not quaff, which means I didn't drink the water. Literally,
Well, yeah, sorry.
where's the implication of?
There's more of a context here. I'm like
Okay,
skimming it and trying to read through it.
okay.
But we can send you some stuff. But there's definitely things here, especially from Babylon. But I also do recall there was also parallel things in Egypt where people were saying like, you gods are arbitrary, and like they're so at least some of them are saying we're innocent. They're not all saying, hey, like let me try to find where I sinned and like turn this inward. Which of
Yeah.
course is the opposite that happens, I'd say, in biblical texts. Because once you have monotheism, and once you say God is just, there's much stronger of a push to say, okay, well, if something bad is happening and God isn't arbitrary and is intelligible, then I better figure out what's going on and what did I do to anger him. But now I have to actually make it logical sense. So I get a mechanistic kind of problematic view to like a low degree monotheism. We can talk about is, how, I think that's where most of his friends are coming from in Job. And at the same time, like I'd say that's actually a result more of monotheism than anything.
Yeah, well, whether Girard gets that specific point right or not, it is important to him. There's a differentiation between the two gods, the god of the persecutors and the god of victims, and that this voice of the god of victims is the true God, and the voice of the god of the persecutors is this demiurge or something like that. And so what we get, what he sees in the book of Job is Job not going along with the scapegoating. So he sort of puts he becomes a stumbling block for the scapegoat process. It's unable to proceed. And then the friends are basically, all the normal ways in which to move the process forward ritually have sort of stopped. And so Job ends up making his final statements, basically declaring his innocence. He's not going to confess to anything that he didn't do. But then Girard makes it so God comes and gives his speech, and I was very curious. I was like, "What's Girard going to do with the speech of God?" And Girard says, "The God in the speech there at the end of the book of Job is the God of persecutors retreating back into nature as a cover to try to it's basically we're moving away from the ritualized process to the emergent process, and here's the God of the persecutors now railing against Job like that." And I thought that was a strange move for Girard to make. Because I don't see. I don't read the speech of God like that.
I don't think it's a strange move at all. Because here's the thing:
it's interesting for sure.
As long as the world order against which Christ came to preach against, that his gospel assails incessantly, as long as that exists, there will always be a retreat to the God of the persecutors. Because that is the God that describes the world as it is.
Yeah. Well, and this gets to how foundational Girard sees the
Yeah.
scapegoating process
There's
as
actually a point where
this.
he talks about the connection, like he talks about the universe. He's like, it's a that
Mhm.
like the mimetic theory describes the way the universe, the cosmos that we inhabit, operates. And this is why Christ says, "My kingdom is not of this world."
How is this not just Gnostic, like a demiurge created the world?
Yeah,
Uh,
this is where it also feels very Gnostic to me.
right, and there's a way, and there's a way in which, like, even Orthodox Christianity has to acknowledge the way that it is in comparison to, say, Judaism, is somewhat Gnostic.
Yeah, but
And the difference is that unlike Gnosticism, we do not, or certain strands of Neoplatonism, we do not link embodiment to that Gnostic impulse. And because we don't link embodiment to that Gnostic impulse, that means that the view is not one of the material world itself being evil, but that it is on its own, it's not enough, and that it is a need of redemption through the Spirit.
I don't know if I'd go that far. Right? I mean, Christianity certainly sees a lot of the natural world embodiment as evil, right? I mean, this is the aesthetic celibate, right? Like drive
Well, I
of
was trying to.
better to
I
be
would.
part and
Yeah,
outside of the world
I
and not participate.
certainly. It depends on. Yeah, well, it depends on how you want to read Saint Paul. But yeah, Saint Paul can be read as like very, very hostile to embodiment, in certain through certain lenses. And certainly certain like David Bentley Hart, who I adore, like tends to read it that way. That when Paul says sarks, he means sarks, and
Mm-hmm.
but there's no reason there's no reason to not just think that he says what he means and means what he says. I'm just trying to like not offend too many Orthodox sensibilities. And I do have a way. I do think that there's a way that you don't want to end up creating a dualism. And so there's a way that um, I think David's wrong ultimately, even though he has a point, and that may be what Saint Paul means, but maybe Saint Paul was wrong about that.
Do you think
I definitely
Girard makes a
see.
dualism out of the
Yeah, I
god
think
of
sure.
persecutors and the god of victims? Isn't that a dualism that kind of comes out that's kind of irresolvable?
That is a good question, and I would say the answer is no, because only one of them is truly God at the end of the day. Which is, I mean,
Yeah,
that's
I
why
think that's what
it's not a
Girard.
dualism for Girard, because Girard isn't linking it to Girard is specifically not linking. So this is what he does. It's not Gnostic. He's not linking it to the Creator. He's not linking the persecutor God directly to the Creator God. Although those who are advocates of the God of the persecutors can act as if the Creator God is one and the same as the God of the persecutors.
And
But
you're saying that's what happens when he says he's retreating into nature? Not that
he
he's the
actually
creator
right
god, but that he's retreating just into this cover.
he actually links it. But that's why he links it to Satan, which is so as not to root it in the God of creation, but the God of this world. But the God of this world is ultimately like operates in and through us.
For Girard,
What was that?
the God of this world only operates through us.
I would say that I don't know. I can't say that. He always wants to return it to the human though, because remember he has that. I think maybe so, but I don't. He never explicitly says that, so I don't want to put words in his mouth. but he does want to like say, for example, that when the advocates of the god of the persecutor talk about the celestial hosts, that is actually like stands in for the human crowds that are enacting the will of the god of the persecutors, and that we should ignore the celestial hosts language, right? So
Yeah,
I think that may be the case for Girard.
Job uses
But
that language too.
what was that?
Job uses that same language. I don't see how it saves Gerard's argument. I don't know.
I'm
That
not.
doesn't make sense to me. Job uses the same language of the celestial hosts, right? They come up multiple times in the book. They come up in the Friends, they come up with Job, and they come up in God's speech. And they come up in Elihu too, right? I think. Right? Like they're all over the place. And to say that they stand in for the crowds in this one place, but in this other place I'm going to dismiss them completely, and in this third place, they are just kind of standing for nature and they don't have anything to do with the crowds. It seems like this very weird way to take it.
Okay, this is like we're gonna. I think that's a sidetrack that take us a long time, because then we would, in order to resolve that, then we would have the conversation. We would have to have the conversation about what the actual nature of collective intelligences are, and how are we to understand them, and what is their connection to humans and to embodiment and to everything. I mean that's a complicated conversation, and that's like an entire conversation unto itself. But the only question I was trying to answer is like, well, what does Girard think? Was the question that I would. Yeah. Does he ultimately think that the will of the god of this world, the principle that we express as Satan, does he think that this is something that is enacted by humans only? Or does he also think that it's representative of some sort of cosmic principle that operates through humans? I would say he never actually says, but his emphasis is on the human. And I think that's fine, because that's kind of what's important that's kind of what's important to us, right? On our plane. That's what's on our level. And that's what we can that's ultimately the choice we're faced with. Like which God do we want to serve? Do we want to serve the God of the persecutors and continue the cycle of vengeance? Or do we want to serve the God of the victims, who refuses to claim vengeance for himself?
Yeah, and when Girard interprets Job's response to God, this is Girard says that Job finally sees the God of persecutors for who he is. And so he gives this negative interpretation that is usually given to Job's repentance, where he says, I have heard of you with the hearing of my ears, but now my eyes have seen you. That meaning that I now see that you are this terrible God of the persecutors. And his repentance, I don't remember if this is correct, totally correct, but he is something like Job's repentance is a little bit of him playing a trick on the God, he's not groveling at his feet. He's just like, I was wrong to even think that you were God in the first place. And that's kind of the thing. But then this is what's funny, and Girard mentions this to his credit. Right after that, remember, God turns to the friends and says, I'm not happy with you. You didn't speak rightly to me like my servant Job has. And for Girard, this blows his mind. And he writes a little bit on it in the book, where he's like, this is incredible. This God then turns around and says that Job speaks correctly. And he just sort of says it as it's some sort of textual miracle that occurs that sort of allows the reader to then go back into this to the story and then reread it with Job being correct about this God of the person. I don't quite understand
because it doesn't work for him.
Conclusion. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't work for him, because the drama of the book of Job is that it's all from one God. and by essentially trying to disambiguate
Yeah, that's
it.
precisely what he thinks it's not. He actually thinks
Well,
that viewing it
I
as
know,
a
I know.
metaphysical.
That's I'm saying.
Yeah,
He's taking the opposite view. He is basically vacating the drama of the book and vacating the monotheism of the book. To me, it is a dualism. It's dualism like the Zoroastrianism is dualism, which is not to say that they're equal gods or that one is the other, but like, it's a
I
very
would say
innocuous.
that one is not a god
Well, he calls him God the persecutor, so it's God. I mean, he's a lesser
because
God.
no, he's okay. He's using that because for the people who follow the god of the persecutor, okay, he is God. He's an idol. There's a way in which, like, if you worship that,
He shouldn't capitalize
if
it.
you worship Odin, that's God to you. But for us, that would be that you would be worshiping an idol. Same thing for Girard. The god of the persecutor is just not really God. What Girard is saying is the god of the persecutors does not have the final say. That this is false.
Which to me is not consistent. Like, and I know this is the opposite view, right? We're coming from opposite points because to me, Job is actually he is incredibly strongly monotheistic in many ways. Like he does not engage in a powers principalities. Like Job in his speeches never acknowledges the power of any other being except for God. The only threat he ever feels is from God, both from the God of the persecutors and the God of the victims. He's the only God he has a relationship with. He doesn't differentiate between those two, ever. He never makes a distinction. Neither do the people talking to him. The book is by far, I would say, one of the most of the strong. Like, it's not like Psalms where it's like, okay, there's a God above all the gods.
I can see the shadow of the ultimate aporia that we always come to in every single one of our conversations, starting to rear up right now. I won't go there.
But it was bound to come up with this book, obviously, right? Because at some point, like this book, like, but it's more. I'd say it's more than Psalms. It's more. There's many other books where we have language that seems to harken to, like, we can talk about it archaeologically, materially, religious, from the religious, like, more traditional Orthodox positions, but like where God says, I'm the most powerful of the gods, or above the other, above all the other powers, whatever it is. This book never makes that concession. Never seems to even reflect that type of. Even though it seems that Job is actually a pagan, which is fascinating. It's a whole other problem with this book that Girard does not get into. That Job is not Jewish, but he's a very strict monotheist.
I actually was thinking about that while I was reading Girard's text, and I actually think that would actually strengthen Girard's argument, and also I think it would say something. It would say something about, like, why I think Girard's framing is lost on you. Because I think there's a way in which you don't live in that world, right? Because as an observant Jew, there's a thing. There is a way in which I would say, because I don't think that your God. I do not think, Yosef, that your God is the God of the persecutors. Okay, I don't think that the world that you inhabit as an Orthodox observant Jew is necessarily the world that Girard is describing. However, I would say that it is a world that for us Gentiles is pretty much inescapable.
But then take us back to the beginning of the conversation. Girard has a view that this is a fundamental story that's universal and applies to everyone. It fundamentally doesn't, was what you just told me.
I agree. That's part. That gets into why I want to remember. I also said that I want to correct Girard, and I actually think that there are things that are even more fundamental that Girard writes off that actually go at a layer deeper than his mimetic theory. Although I think the mimetic theory is useful, and here's what it's specifically useful in: the mimetic theory describes the world that that you live in, Yosef, maybe not as an Orthodox Jew, but that you live in as a North American living in the 21st century. It does describe the world that you live in. That world it does describe. And I would say that the God of the world that rules that world is Mammon, which is the god of which is the god of the persecutors, which relies on mimetic processes in order to have his throne, and will remain on that throne so long as we continue to worship him.
I'm not sure I fully buy it, but that's not surprising. I hear you. I think, Jess, can you? I don't. Can you? There's a passage that you took a picture of already, and you should have it. Though the passage about the path of the wicked being the same as the path of the redeemed.
I was just going to bring that up. So Girard has a unification in his theory, but he doesn't. I wish he would bring it to the fore. He doesn't bring it to the fore. The first time he brings it up is subtly. He says the idolized hero king is put in that position by the same processes as the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
The mimetic the mimetic process in society raises someone up to the position of hero or king, and they get there, and it's the same social energy that then demands that there's a scapegoat. And Peterson points this out. Well, society's figured this out, and Peterson points this out in the story of like when the Babylonian king or Mesopotamian kings, they would be subject to a humiliation ritual where they're supposed to say all the ways they were not a good Marduk, and they were, they flagellated themselves or whatever. And
actually, Girard talks about that too.
They were made a scapegoat for a day or however a period of time, and then they're re-exalted back up as the king. And this was supposed to help provide a catharsis for the society. So, all right, so Job essentially follows that same sort of process. Job is sort of put in this high place. This is where Girard will agree with the prologue. He says that Job was put up in a high place, and now he's fallen down. He's made a scapegoat, and then at the end, he's re-exalted again. And so he says, okay, so that's the one thing. The same sort of processes are in place to exalt as well as bring the scapegoat down. Okay, so that's the first hint of it. But then he talks about Christ explicitly in the book, and he says the path that Christ takes, and then he's also saying that this is the path that Job takes as well, is the same path that Eliphaz talks about when he says the path of the wicked. So the path the wicked take down from their place of prominence all the way down to being punished for their wickedness and being made the scapegoat of society and being purged from the community through exile or death. That process is also the path that Christ takes in order to become the revealer of the God of victims. So he says the path of the wicked and the path of the God of victims is exactly the same. And so then in my mind,
right, and there's a reason for this, Jess. Okay, so the reason he says that the God of victims the reason the God of victim has to manifest in the way that Christ does is that it's the only way that doesn't start the whole process over again. The point is that what Christ never does is that Christ never cries out for vengeance. As he's being nailed to the cross, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And Girard thinks he says that he means that quite literally. By the way, he thinks that Christ is in other works. He says that in other parts of Girard's work, he says that Christ says that because Christ is aware of the mimetic process, which is what he's trying to destroy through his revelation, and that he's saying that his persecutors are unaware of the process in which they are participating.
Right. Okay. I have to just say one thing, and then Yosef. For me, this is like, so Girard basically says Christ does this in order to expose the mechanism, and then once it's made conscious, it loses its ability to be a potent force in society, and so then we must love one another. Yadi. So that's what he says. He says,
Well, he also says it will result in us doing it more and more to get less and less effect. Which
right,
is,
right. That's what I mean. Like it'll have less effect if it does progress. Like it won't be as effective because he's exposed it. For me, I'm almost at the exact. I take an opposite view. If I'm holding to Girard's theory, I want to say that the path of the wicked was the path of righteousness all along. And that
no,
this is exactly your tweet, Nate, was that it wasn't about sacrifice, it was about gift. And what all the mimesis and what it was all about was wanting someone, a hero king, to come and give himself as gift towards us. And that's what holds the world together. And that this is voluntary self-sacrifice. This is Christ incarnate. This is loving one another, and that's the foundation of things. But Girard just
which is why I said. By the way, notice in that tweet, there's a reason why I said it creates and sustains a world.
Yeah, like no, your tweet was awesome.
To get what I'm saying there, that's like an important part of that. You have to acknowledge that sacrifice as sacrifice does create and sustain a world. But the world that it creates and sustained is the world that is ruled by the God of the persecutors. That's the world that creates and sustains. And you know what?
That's what Jess is saying.
No,
that's not what Jess is saying. Hold on.
Yeah, go ahead, Yosef.
I know.
Okay. Because Jess had it. You've said this to me before. I want to put it. You had a very good way to put this. I'm just going to take your words and repeat them here. Was Girard sees this entire mimetic process in its very negative sense. But in some sense, if we can, there's another way to see it, which is in a positive sense, that it only exists to allow Jesus to do his.
Girard sees it in a positive sense too, though. That's the thing. This is what I was trying to explain. Is that Girard agrees with you. Girard agrees with you. I don't know if you can see it as much in this particular text, but Girard definitely agrees with you. There was an interview where Girard said that the mimetic process is also responsible for all heroism and virtue.
Yeah, right. But why does he? Okay, so for me, let me just have like 2 minutes to sketch something out.
Sure.
So I a little bit of a side, but it's coming right back. I have this book over right there called "Drawing from the Right Side of the Brain," and it was this woman who discovered all the left and right hemisphere brain study work that was going on, and she was an artist, and so she delved really deep into that literature and tried to apply it to being an artist, and specifically she was a teacher, an art teacher, and so what she did is she found all sorts of useful ways that enabled her to teach people how to draw and paint. So she would have people come in and do drawing tests. She would ask them to draw stuff, and then she would record the results, and she would instruct them different ways to draw it. So, trying to figure out how people could think like an artist. And what she discovered was that if people know what they're looking at, they'll draw it in sort of rudimentary symbolic shapes rather than how it looks. So for example, she asked people to draw a cart with a projector on it. They're like one of those school carts that you would wheel into a classroom that had a projector and like some equipment and some cords attached to it. She asked people to draw that. And so they would draw it, and it would always come out a little bit skewed looking because they think they know what they look at. They're like, I know what a projector is. It's rectangle. But at the perspective you're looking at, it's not a perfect rectangle. It's got angles to it. And so people would draw what they think they knew rather than how it appeared. So then she told them, don't draw the objects, draw the negative shapes around the objects. So draw the outline of the cart and the projector and the cords and everything as if it was one thing. So what she found out that this drawing the negative spaces actually enabled people who are not trained artists to then render things more accurately. So you see these drawings that people did before when they, when they thought they knew what they were drawing and it's skewed. Then it shows the drawings afterwards when they're drawing the negative space, the outline, and it would become more accurate to what it actually looked like. The rendering was more accurate. And so for me, this is what apophatic theology is. Approaching things in the negative is not just an interesting way to do theology. Approaching things in the negative is flipping you're using a different side of your brain, and you're actually able to render things more true to how they appear. But here's the thing: like, you're still drawing you're drawing the negative space, but in your mind, when you view the image, it has to flip at some point, and you're not seeing the negative space. You see the cart with the projector on it. For me, this is exactly what's happening with Girard. He's outlined the scapegoat process, the mimetic rivalry, the mimesis, and all that. He's drawn all the negative space, and for me, it flips. The image flips, and I see the positive come out of it, and he does too. But he still keeps describing the negative space all the time. And,
well, yeah,
and he
that's
insists on the negative space.
Part of that is him trying to stay within his constraints as an anthropologist. Although in some of his later works, he does
Well, I think
more
that's the
explicitly
problem.
theologically.
I think that's exactly the problem, because the academy wants you to say that those negative space shapes that you saw are the real things. Mm-hmm. And so there's this weird thing where you have to double down on your theories as the thing itself, rather than saying, no, this was the reverse image of something else that appears once I've outlined this stuff. And you can't do like, how do you do that in an academic paper? You basically just say, well, I meant the opposite of
so that's why I think that the thing that's missing from Girard never defined sacrifice. Like, quite notoriously, he never actually defines the term sacrifice anywhere in his book. And that's why I want to make this move where I talk about the concept of debt being actually deeper than the mimetic process in terms of explanatory power of the real.
Can I pause there for a second, though?
Yeah.
Okay. One, that was a really cool analogy, Jess, because it reminds me of it's a midrash, but a very good kind of accessible version of this is Vervaeke and Zevi Slavin, and one of, I can't remember if it was Guy or Chris. They had, when they did their series on Buber, Zevi talked about how there's this idea that there's a one letter in the Torah. There's like 600. This isn't actually the case, but symbolically, there's like one letter corresponding to every Jew from like the 600,000 in the census in the desert, and that everyone has a letter, and that, but there's one letter that no one counts as a letter, which is the white space of the actual scroll. That is the biggest letter of them all, and that's God. Like that is the last part of the conversation, is that empty negative space, which you make for each other, because without that you can't hear each other, right? Or you just be a massive ink, right? It's the white spaces that allow you to differentiate between all of that multiplicity and make it meaningful. But that itself is a contraction making space for each other. So I really like where you're going with this similar thing, but with this in this visual domain. At the same time, I thought you were going to go the other way. When I was listening to you, I was like, and you're going to tell me that Girard doubles down because he has this theory and he has this lens, and he keeps, so he's going to draw what he thinks is there in the text, that projector, which is not where you went, which I'm glad that I didn't hop in and I gave you the space to explain what you were talking about. Though I'm not sure. In some ways, I kind of see both, because I think it can
be like, as soon as we think we know we see something, you fall into those errors. So
Right.
I think the analogy works, but I think Girard is I think where Girard actually sees something. There's a shape of something there that is real, but I think that's how it makes
Girard was
sense to me.
also. It's important to point out that Girard was also open to refinement of his own ideas. It's not like he thought. It's not like he thought I got it right in Violence and the Sacred, and I never need to change this, because it actually like develops quite a bit over the course of his work, and he was definitely open to criticisms and modifications of his theory. But I still think that like in terms of being a theory that has explanatory power and the world that we live in, that to me is definitely not. It's definitely not yet the creation because the fall happened, right? So it's not
So
the creation as God. You would have to at least concede, Yosef, without any dualism, that it's not the creation as God intended after the fall.
so this gets to a couple things. I could go in a couple different directions with that.
Go for it.
I think one though is um, I on the idea of exposing, and does exposing help? So I think there's a fundamental kind of idea here that comes from psychotherapy, right? Like if I can understand better like my subconscious, like desires and things going on, we can talk about whether this is Freud or Jung or Lacan or wherever, kind of Girard getting influenced from or reacting to. He has this idea that exposure will solve the problem, right? Like if I just can expose it,
No,
no,
he
he
actually
doesn't.
does. He
Well, I
doesn't.
know he has
No,
amnesia.
in fact,
He has amnesia. He definitely has this the mechanism of amnesia. He talks about that, but
yeah.
fundamentally, he thinks if you expose it, that is ultimately going to be a solution. You just have to keep like maintaining that exposure, and reminding yourself of it and refreshing it, right?
Well, he also
Mhm.
says. I mean, he also says in places that Christianity predicts its own failure. So I don't think
Explain.
he. Well, because Christianity, like as an institution, is still subject to those same mimetic processes that control our world, and so Christianity, what does it end up doing? I mean, this is like the conversation. The conversation I just hosted about King's North against Christian civilization. Like,
Yes.
if anyone didn't realize it, like this is all hanging in the background of that conversation for sure, because like that's the point is that when like as much as things are participate in the mechanisms of this world, they will end up becoming corrupted. This is the same thing that Ivan Illich means when he talks about the corruption of the best is the worst, and the way in which the church has been co-opted into that. Now that doesn't not. Now Girard doesn't think that it's an ultimate failure. That is right. He does think, but he gives an interesting answer in his interview with David Cayley on the CBC series that aired like before he died in the '90s, I think it was. It's very interesting because David Cayley like says to him at one point in the interview, "This is a very dark picture that you paint. What if anything can we do about it?" And Girard's answer is Christians need to be Christian again. And Girard specifically does not mean that in a way that that he's suggesting institutional Christianity needs to be bolstered. That's not what he's saying. What he means is that Christians need to actually imitate the right model. That is that so the solution that he offers to the mimetic crisis is actually imitation of the one model that we all can imitate without any fear of scarcity or competition or rivalry.
I have a hard time buying it's only about institutional Christianity because I read the New Testament and it does a lot of scapegoating. Like just the text, like the apostles, whoever you believe wrote those, whether you think they were the disciples, whether they're a little bit later, they're oral traditions, doesn't matter. There's immediate scapegoating and it's put in the mouth of Jesus sometimes, right? So it's very hard for me. And we can try to sanitize it. We can try to read it as generously as possible. It's very hard for me to say this is just institutional, and because it seems to me to be part and parcel, like from the very beginning of the foundational text itself. And it's not surprising. Sectarian Judaism in the Second Temple period was a mess of mimesis or whatever mimetic violence. We could talk all about that. But it's very hard for me to say like, oh, this clearly frees you from all that in a way that the Bible already doesn't, right? In the way that the Hebrew Tanakh already doesn't free you from that. Like to me, the Yom Kippur ceremony, the stories that we already have of a lot of Job, right? Of Yosef, of of King David. We can go through probably a whole list. Tamar, Judah, right? Like those already do all this work, but they don't. I mean, it's interesting because we can say like,
Yosef, let's not get. I think there's a chance at something really good here if we can get past like the propositional particularities here, because I would say that when Girard makes that gesture, not only is he not talking about institutional Christianity, he's also not talking about propositional Christianity. He's talking about people actually behaving as Christ behaved, living the kind of life that Christ lived. That's what he means. Now, I would say that Christ, as a faithful Jew formed by Jewish culture, the actual life he lived was clearly informed by the Judaism that he practiced. Correct? So actually, there's a moment here. I think there's a way here where we can actually come together rather than bickering about who scapegoated whom or their propositional.
Well, I don't know that he's any more free of the mimetic, like not violence, but like the inertial phase of kind of whatever. Because I don't see him as unique in that. Like I see him as participating very much in the dialogue of his Second Temple period Judaism, and therefore, like, so I don't see how he breaks you out of that. But I do see what you're saying. Like, I get where you're going. I'm still here. I need like 5 minutes to do the sunset prayer, but I will be right back.
Prayer is more important than us. Go pray.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think of. There's an inherent problem that Girard points out, and I'm also reading Jung's book on Job, and Jung is struggling with this too, which is, well, I'll just talk about Girard. But
is that any good? Because I've heard, by reputation, I've heard that Jung's book on Job is
wild.
pretty terrible.
It is not very rigorous because he's applying his theories.
Girard's isn't very rigorous, to be fair.
No, this isn't either. This is another application of theory. And it's very much like, I don't know how much editing was really done on this. Like it seems like it was very much stream of consciousness, getting things out there. Like it's organized, like it's not it's not a mess, but there seems to be, like, if we take Girard's theory and we just say, okay, we have this God of victims that's been revealed as the true God, we actually there's a problem, which I think it's hinted at the end of the book of Job even. So what happens at the end of the book of Job is, so he does the friends bring a sacrifice, he offers a prayer for them. And then after that, it says, everyone that knew Job from before, all his brothers and sisters and all his friends, then came to him in his house and ate bread with him and comforted him for the evil that God had done to him. So there is this beautiful picture of everyone coming into the house of Job. Mm-hmm. And you can even project this onto what will happen as everyone comes into the house of Christ and becomes a part of the body of Christ. Here's the problem, though. At the end of the book of Job, everyone's comforting Job for the evil that God did to him. And so they're doing what is proper, and they're comforting Job, which the friends didn't, or they started accusing him. So that's good. But for the evil that God done them, meaning that Job had a revelation of God when God came and spoke to him in the whirlwind. And so I take that as Job having a vision of God that resolves however you conceive of it. It resolves what conflict Job had, and then comforts him. That's kind of like the foundational thing. I think the translation where he says Job repents in dust and ashes, it's actually he's comforted in the dust and ashes. So Job is comforted in the end by this interaction with God. And now the people only see God in the terms, the evil that God did to him. And there's something right about that, because God did enable or allowed terrible things to be done to Job. And so, we don't want to just be like, oh, it was all a gift, it was blessing. That's, you can't necessarily just say that. So, but the people didn't have their own revelation of God themselves. They instead have now gathered, but God doesn't come out looking so good.
Right.
But okay.
Yeah, so well, from the standpoint of Girard is just completely. I mean, you're starting to talk about things that definitely invite like the sort of like metaphysical, like problem evil way of viewing the Book of Job that has been pretty dominant in exegesis.
And Girard points this out. He's like, now the God of victims is here. We may have, you already pointed out, like you may have the situation where now the victim is going to scapegoat the scapegoater, which is now just another scapegoating process. Correct. And so, Girard warns against this, and but there is,
which is why he has that line about, why he has that line against, like talking against revolution, right? So it's like what the God of the victims can't be the spirit of revolution. Actually, the spirit of revolution is still the God of the persecutors. It's just flipping it. It's just flipping the cycle.
Yeah, Zizek has this excellent conception that
I actually Zizek in the back of my mind, and I thought that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this, is because I know that you had read some Zizek, and some of what Zizek has to say, well, although they're pushed quite far.
Yeah, they are.
Might shed some light here. Go ahead.
Well, he said, like, say you have someone that has some sort of what's the word? It's not psychosis. It's some sort of psychology term for like a imbalance.
Okay. Neurosis.
Yeah. Not a neurosis. I can't remember. Anyway, you have this imbalance that it makes you extremely jealous of your wife.
Okay.
And you have this extreme jealousy. This is the example he gives that I think applies. You have this extreme jealousy towards your wife, and let's say, like this is an imbalance in you. You're not acting properly towards her. But let's say she's actually cheating on you. Does that make your imbalance right or not? He says no. He's like, you still have a problem. It doesn't matter what the facts are on the ground, whether your wife was cheating or whether she was faithful or not. Your jealousy is still a symptom of something deeper that you're not getting to. And in fact, your wife cheating on you just makes this even more problematic to get to. And so it's the same. So if we apply this to what we were just talking about, which now I can't remember.
No, that's good. That's good, because I think ultimately, Girard would have to recognize that ultimately, like for mimetic processes, the guilt or innocence of the victim is ultimately irrelevant.
Yeah. So you have the situation where you're like, oh, I'm going to punish them because they're actually oppressors. You're still caught in the same wrong process. It doesn't matter if they're oppressors or not.
Why does confession matter then, if it doesn't matter if they're innocent or guilty? Why does it matter that Job doesn't give in? Like, for Girard, that's really important in this exegesis, right? That Job maintains his integrity, that somehow undoes what's going to happen with the scapegoating process. But it shouldn't matter if he's innocent.
Yeah, this is another strange thing, and I talked about this with you, Yosef, which is that Girard sort of says that, like, Job has to play his part in order for this whole ritual to take place, in order for the scapegoating to make sense. Because if he doesn't go along with it, it won't have the catharsis that it needs, and the ritual has these requirements, yada yada yada. there's another point that Zizek makes when he talks about the differences between the Nazis and the Stalinists. And he says this is true for the Stalinists. The Stalinists demand that everyone participate in the whole process. So you would have a mock trial. You would be forced to confess your guilt. You would be sent to the gulag. And even in the gulags, the prisoners would then sign like birthday cards for Stalin, and they would sing patriotic songs. They would be forced to sing patriotic songs and participate in the whole communist drama. They would be made to play their part. Whether they wanted to or not, it didn't matter. You have to play your part. And then he compares that to the Nazis, and he says, wouldn't it be ridiculous if they forced the Jews in the concentration camps to write letters to Hitler? The Nazis didn't care. They didn't care if you participated in their drama. Like, you were just there to be scapegoated. There was no requirement that you participate in anything. And so
Well, because of I would think there's a reason for that difference, though. I mean, the reason for that difference is that in the case of the Stalinist regime, there was nothing there. It wasn't like the thing that they were accused of was an ideological crime, right? And it was not like it wasn't anything that was like considered an inherent property.
I mean, they would do that, but they would still persecute people groups. They would say it was ideological, but it was
for sure.
It was ethnic based.
Girard also talks about the way in which this plays out in totalitarian regimes too in the book.
Yeah, and that might be part of the reason why people still get hung up on where communism goes wrong. Where I think the Nazis were a lot more blatant with their stuff, and in at least Stalinism and even Maoism, they wrap it in all these layers of participation and it's ideological, it's not ethnic or whatever. While you're murdering people out in Tajikistan or wherever, because you've got to break them from their cultural heritage in order to get them to participate in your society. And maybe it's this sort of demand by the communists that everyone participate that I don't know, like it still sort of has its claws in parts of the world where we've kind of mostly agreed in the world that the Nazis were bad. And then
but another reason for the difference though too is that the people that were in the gulags were still seen as like they were still seen as a part of the society that was outcast, but they were still part of the society. Whereas from the Nazi point of view, the Jews were not even like they were not even human.
Yeah, they were just
so
they were trash to be dealt with, or bugs or whatever.
Yeah. Let's talk about something that's related to this, right? So this has come up now in the background of a couple of parts of the most recent rounds of this, is that you told me what Girard was doing was a form of theology. And I wanted to say that I was making space to kind of hear more how he went down this road. Is he doing theology, or is he trying to talk about therapy? Right? When we talk about exposure, we're talking about, and especially Zizek is obviously talking about the therapeutic, right? Those are very different modes of with different goals, right? Theology is trying to explain a truth of the universe. Therapy is trying to help an individual, whatever person. And somewhere in this to talk about,
I don't know that that's a bright line for me, Yosef. I'll tell you why. Because I think as human beings. Okay, go ahead.
Hold on.
All right.
When we're talking about the participation versus non-participation here under totalitarian states, right? Part of that is that there's at least an idea within Stalinism that I wanted to convince. It's important for me to convince you that we're right? That could be either one. That could be either theology or therapy. We could talk about that. But there is an idea of rehabilitation there and getting you to my truth, whether that's whatever universal truth or something. Whereas that's not the case, right? If I just write you off, I don't care if you're part of this discussion, and I don't need to convince you of my theology because you're already doomed to hell or whatever, or you're not human or whatever. We can talk about different versions of that. Whereas it's important for me to convince you. That's a very right. It's just a different mode of. It's a much more right. We can talk about. It's in some ways. It's almost like a form of the more dialogic
Did
mode.
you
Where
did you see my?
except it's the Philo-Nicaea, but I'm trying to convince you.
Right. No, I think that's right. Although I don't think I was going to say is I don't know that ultimately how bright the line between theology and therapy is, because I think that ultimately um, we we're sick and in need of healing, and that's a very deep theological truth. And so for
I think
me,
it matters here. It matters to what we've been talking about, because this is the difference between reading through every chapter of the book and allowing all that complexity and nuance to work on you, because you have to go through all of that therapy to get there. And you have to take the book, even from Girard's view, right? Like you have to wrap it in things that like undermine it or make it, more palatable or whatever it is. You have to put the sugar in the medicine to make it go down. That's therapy. It is not, it's different where theology, at least some form, is just like, this is the truth, and I'm going to proclaim it from the mountaintop, and like I want you to just, be convinced of it, and I don't need to push you through the process. Right? I think there's still a difference that matters here. It's a matter of approach.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I don't think I care for. I don't think I see theology that way. That's interesting. Um, there was something else that I wanted to talk about because when you were talking about the difference between the Stalinist persecutions and the Nazis, there was this weird dark moment in my conversation with Dr. David Dean when I was talking about his book Tyranny of the Banal, and he was talking about the way in which, like, from the medieval mindset, like Thomas Aquinas said that Thomas Aquinas and Plato both said that execution was good for the soul of the condemned. And then Aquinas specifically defends the idea that execution should not be quick and painless, but should be as drawn out and painful as possible, because from Aquinas' point of view, it causes an ontological transformation in the
It's
condemned.
wild.
So,
which I recognize and also don't recognize, because within Jewish thought, the execution, like when it's done under the auspices of a Beit Din, like a Sanhedrin, and they are found guilty under all the proper processes, and the processes are very complex and maybe never, or almost never carried out to their fullest extent. But even if someone went through all that process, the punishment, there isn't a view that is part of the repentance atonement process. But at the same time, the executioners, or not the executioners, but primarily, the executioners are the witnesses, right? In biblical texts, the witness has to be the one who kills the person, and the judges who render judgment, everything that they do has to be toward the furthering of the dignity of the person and minimizing their pain and suffering. It doesn't matter what the repentance process.
Oh,
the punishment.
Dr. Dean and I were obviously both appalled by what Aquinas had to say. We were essentially able to agree with Aquinas. The reason I want to bring this up is this kind of actually plays a little bit to my point about how, like, the institutionalization of Christianity kind of like loses the thread, because it's very clear to see within what Aquinas is arguing for, mimetic processes. Like, he's actually talking about the process, like, because he actually sees it as connected to the theosis of the person who is being condemned. He specifically is putting public torture, is linking it to deification, which is about as explicitly mimetic an argument as you could possibly make.
Yeah.
And so clearly, the God that
I want to connect it to two other things, though. I think one is there is an idea that if one by suffering in this world, one has less suffering in the world to come, in hell, or less time in purgatory, or whatever. Both of these ideas come out in both. Obviously, differently in Judaism, but we see it, I believe, in Catholicism too, where, so yes, you make it, they suffer more here, but this suffering is nothing compared to the suffering on the other side. So so I can see how it could be justified. I mean, in a very twisted kind of like way,
I
I can
get
see
the
it.
rational, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it is out there. The other thing though, is I want to bring this back to kind of the Jovian discussion more broadly, right? And something that I think maybe is a point of divergence often, like when I talk to Christians around this. You didn't immediately react. I mean, you reacted to Aquinas, but you didn't immediately react to the idea that execution itself could be part of the atonement or repentance process, even if you don't go anywhere like Aquinas. But I think, right.
I'm anti definitely. I think you know.
I'm sure. I know you would. I know you would react to it. I think that the thing is, there's something to this that I want to open up a little bit more, though. Not just so you don't like to get you to engage and not just like immediately have like a whatever an instinctual reaction. Is King David?
Yeah.
He admits his sin. He confesses. He goes through a whole repentance process, and in many ways, he kind of goes through. A smaller version, but a pretty still suffering, challenging version of this, like something similar to Job. At the same time, for he can't, for him to actually go through the process, he has to go through the consequences of his actions. He can't get out of that by going through the process. They don't give him a get out. I mean, this is not talking about death and sacrifice, except I don't agree with your whole death sacrifice thing for the Bible. But at the same time, I don't agree to that. At the same time, I do think there is something. I don't think it's debt. I think it's the wrong framing. But there's something where David.
I'm not sure that's where I'm going to land either. That's just what I'm using as the placeholder for what I'm trying to figure out how to articulate.
Because this is an idea that Girard talks about from Job, from chapter 22 with the path of the wicked. And really, chapter 22 can't be read without reading chapter 21, because literally, like, the friend of Eliphaz is using the same language that Job is, and he's like just responding point by point through of 21 to 22. So you have to really look at both chapters together, which I don't remember Girard really, he doesn't do at all. But
no, he doesn't.
But part of that is that so, the way basically the wicked are trapped in their own devices, right? Girard is going to talk about this, right? This is kind of this natural consequence, like, theology of, natural justice that's going to happen to some degree. And this is the friends are talking about this. And obviously the New Testament weighs in on this. And in some ways, I mean, it's not so far, right? Because yes, you can go through and try to mitigate the consequences of the process, but at the same time, like, unless you live it out and like actually face the consequences properly, you don't really ever get to that deeper thing. This just gets to Zizek, right? You don't get to that deeper thing be under the jealousy, because you're basically just short-circuiting it. And I know Girard wants you short-circuit in a good way through his books. This is confusing, but short-circuit in this bad way where you just say, okay, well, they're already guilty, so I don't actually have to deal with this inside of me, because I can just project it onto them and we're done. Anyway, that was a little bit rambly, but like, I think there is this other element that is like dealing with this facing of consequences, and like, is that the God of the persecutor, like, or is that just like, this is where it gets confusing for me, because God, I mean, has, to some extent, I mean, it's not always the case, and there's like differences in general revelation and special revelation, or whatever, general law, natural law, and kind of covenantal law. But at some level, like, we all, including Girard, and like, we all kind of agree that, when you set off a chain of things, like, there are going to be consequences, and you can't really get out of that. But it's not like you owe a debt to those consequences. It's almost like a debt to yourself, but it's not really a debt. It's like the wrong way. That's the wrong framing. You know what I'm getting at?
Well, we can set aside the whole debt thing. I think we can set aside the whole debt thing for a moment.
I have to go in like a couple minutes. Just so you know.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we do have a sense, although we do have a sense that like justice, like we do say things like that justice is owed, and we still do have a tendency when we're talking about justice to turn to that language of debt. So I'm not sure that isn't the right thing to point at. And so I think we might have to do this in another part, because I think that now I think the Girard's fundamental anthropology seems to be, I don't, let me see if you, seems to be fairly Augustinian. And because I think his argument depends on, notice how many times he criticizes the Rousseauian tendencies of his fellow anthropologists, right? So clearly, like, one of the reasons Girard is able to see this is that he sees human nature as being particularly corrupt. So I don't think that's clearly driving Girard's entire way of conceiving this, which is one of the reasons, by the way, I don't think he's quite right. Although he has a point. I think he has a very important point to make. And I think that we should say that we have to go. And I think maybe we need to move beyond, for the second part of this conversation. I think maybe we do need to go beyond Girard, and I need to maybe start trying to work through whatever it is that I'm trying to articulate with the two of you together. And then I think that will definitely talk about, like, the issue of, like, well, what is our fundamental nature? And if Girard is wrong about what our fundamental nature is, I think that mimetic theory can't be fully explanatory on its own. Right.
It has to be nested into something else.
Correct. It has to be nested into something else that drives the. Basically what I'm saying is that he's one layer too high up, and that there's actually something underneath that actually causes the mimesis in the first place.
I mean, this was always a problem with Girard, right? Like, where the initial drives come from, the initial desire that sets off the entire cycle of mimesis, is because this is always, like, I mean, I don't know him as well as you do. Maybe he does address this somewhere, because it's clearly, like, to me, it's a gap. I can't imagine he ever did.
There's a gap, particularly, that I've noticed in the area that I want to talk about, because he discards Marx so readily without thinking that Marx has anything to add to the discussion. But Marx, in pointing towards scarcity as a root cause of violence, is onto something that Girard is ignoring. Because I actually don't think scarcity and sacrifice can be separated, which Girard chooses to do by focusing exclusively on sacrifice.
Yeah.
Well, in the mimetic competition, I think it's embedded that there's scarcity, isn't it?
Yes.
Whether it's virtual
because mimesis only happens when the thing can't be shared. But why?
If there's a gap on where the initial desire comes from, the that sets off the whole cycle, then that's not just a zero condition gap, right? That's actually a gap that persists through everything, because that means if I can't explain how, like, why does that not happen in every generation with every person? Like, why aren't they always generating new desires? If I can't explain that, an initial desire theory, then I can't explain why there isn't a plethora of desires, right? It's much more than just like he misses one gap. And this was what I said, I don't know if I buy this, because it's just like Freud seeing phalluses everywhere. Like, the difference between Freud and even like a Lacan, much less like a Jung, is like they talk about a lot more possible, drives, right? That's fundamentally already the difference.
Well, he's not saying that there aren't other fundamental drives. What he's saying is that basically all of our desires that aren't fundamental drives. So, like, Girard is not saying that the sex drive is mimetic. That's just a fundamental biological drive. He's excluding those things from his analysis. He's talking about all the things that we desire that are at a layer above those fundamental drives that we all share.
But did they all collapse to it?
What was
at
that?
The next level? Did all of those fundamental drives at the next level?
He's saying he's recognizing there's a multiplicity of them. He's saying that we create them through mimesis. Like, that's how we desire what our neighbors and our culture tell us to desire. Mm-hmm. Like, we get our desire, we get those desires that are not our fundamental basic desires from our models. Our models create those desires, and I think maybe in the next conversation we need to talk about, maybe we just go beyond Girard, and I want to talk about like maybe like what could be possibly beneath the layer of mimesis, even, which I suspect that there is something there.
Mm-hmm.
And we could talk about the way in which we put mimetic processes into overdrive in our current age because of propaganda, which is ubiquitous.
Yes, this is one of my the drums I like to beat with Jess around the U-shaped theory, is how it's how thanks to Star Wars for the most part, and how U-shaped theory was shopped around Hollywood as the way to write a story for a decade, and that's really captured the culture in a way that I think, instead of exposing something, actually has done more harm.
Interesting.
Oh man, we're gonna end on that note, Joseph.
Oh no, we don't have to end on that note. We don't have to end on that note.
Yeah, but Jess, as the person who has spent by far in this conversation the most time and energy contemplating Job, I want to give you the last word.
Well, I think I said everything I wanted to say. I think it's really interesting to what you were talking about, Nate, is trying to get at what's underneath Girard's thing. I mean, for me, I already kind of spoke to what I think that is. I think it's the need, the need for someone to do that, follow the path willingly, and for our sake, to hold the world together. Something like that. And yeah, for me, that's the U-shaped journey, but we'll have to discuss that.
Well, I would say it can't. If Girard's claim is about the God of the victims is right, it can't just be someone.
It can't just be what?
It can't just be any someone. Because if it's just any someone, then you would run the risk of starting the cycle all over again.
Yeah, and that's that weird thing, the connection between the idol and the scapegoat and all that, which would be interesting to explore. But I gotta go.
All right,
guys, it was great talking to you.
Thank you. You guys have a good Thanksgiving.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.